November 12th, 1944. The Texas hill country lay quiet under an autumn sky that stretched from horizon to horizon, unbroken blue, except for distant clouds gathering over the Guadalupe River Valley. Robert Harrison stood on the wooden porch of his ranch house, one hand resting on the weathered post his father had carved from live oak 40 years earlier, the other holding a telegram that had arrived 2 weeks ago and changed everything. The telegram was brief, bureaucratic, the kind of communication that reduced human lives to logistics and property to resources. His ranch had been selected to house German prisoners of war, female prisoners. The War Department needed facilities away from major population centers, places where security could be maintained without causing public alarm. His 3,500 acres of isolated prairie, 30 miles from Fredericksburg, fit their requirements perfectly. He was 52 years old enough to remember the last war, young enough to feel the weight of this one pressing on his shoulders like a physical burden. His two sons served overseas, one in the Pacific, one somewhere in France. The letters came irregularly censored, revealing nothing of what they actually experienced. He read between the lines and understood enough to lie awake at night staring at the ceiling beams and praying to a God he was no longer certain listened. Behind him, the screen door opened with its familiar creak. His mother emerged, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron, the same apron she had worn for 20 years, patched and repatched until more mending than original fabric remained. Margaret Harrison was 74 years old, spine still straight, eyes still sharp, mind still quick with the kind of wisdom that came from surviving droughts, depressions, and the death of a husband who had built this ranch from nothing but determination and debt. She moved beside him without speaking, following his gaze down the Kalash road that cut through the mesquite and prickly pear toward the main highway. In the distance, dust rose against the horizon, 3 columns of it growing larger. The convoy, 23 women, the telegram said. German auxiliary personnel captured during the Allied advance through France. Not combat soldiers, but support staff. Communications operators, nurses, clerks, radio technicians. Young women who had worn uniforms and followed orders and now found themselves 8,000 miles from home, prisoners in a country they had been taught to fear or hate or both. Margaret spoke quietly, her voice carrying the slight German accent she had never quite lost despite 60 years in Texas. Her parents had immigrated in 1870, part of the wave of German settlers who had made Fredericksburg and the surrounding hill country their own, bringing with them language and culture and recipes that persisted through generations. These women are somebody's daughters, she said. We will treat them accordingly. Robert nodded slowly. He knew his mother's capacity for both fierce judgment and unexpected mercy. She had strong opinions about the Nazi regime, about Hitler's madness, about the evil that had consumed the land of her ancestors. But she drew clear distinctions between governments and people, between those who commanded and those who obeyed, between guilt and complicity, and the terrible gray areas where most human beings actually lived. The first truck stopped near the barn engine, coughing dust and diesel smoke. The door opened and a man in military uniform stepped down, his movements crisp despite obvious travel fatigue. Captain George Williams, the telegram said his name was. He had processed prisoners at camps in Colorado and New Mexico, understood protocols, knew how to maintain security without unnecessary harshness. Behind him, more trucks carried supplies, construction materials for fencing, medical equipment, and armed guards who looked as uncomfortable with this assignment as Robert felt about receiving it. Then came the transport carrying the prisoners themselves, a covered truck that pulled to a stop in the yard between the barn and the converted bunkhouse. The back canvas flap opened, and women began climbing down, blinking in the November sunlight that felt warm compared to whatever they had left behind, but would soon prove inadequate against Texas winter nights. 23 of them, ages ranging from what looked like late teens to early 30s, wearing remnants of gray auxiliary uniforms. Some had coats too thin for coming weather. Others clutched small bags that contained everything they still owned in this world. Robert had expected hardness in their faces, the cold defiance of enemy soldiers. Instead, he saw exhaustion, confusion, and something that looked uncomfortably like fear. They stood in a ragged group, uncertain where to look or what to do, conditioned by months of captivity to wait for orders before moving or speaking. Anna Schmidt was the first to survey her surroundings with any systematic attention. She was 24 years old, dark hair pulled back from a face that would have been beautiful if not for the hollowness that hunger and stress had carved into her cheeks. She had served as a communications officer in occupied France, operating radio equipment that transmitted messages she never questioned. Coordinates she never wondered about, orders she simply followed, because following orders was what good German girls did. Her capture 3 months earlier had been almost absurdly anticlimactic. No dramatic battle, no heroic last stand. Simply Allied tanks or you rolling into her unit's position faster than retreat could be organized, and suddenly she was surrendering to American soldiers who looked as surprised to capture women as she was to be captured. The journey to America had been a blur of ships and trains and processing centers where she understood nothing of what was being said to her, though her English was better than she let anyone know. Now standing in this vast open space under an enormous sky, she felt smaller than she ever had in her life. The ranch looked nothing like the stark military compound she had imagined. It looked like a working farm, alive and functional, with horses watching the commotion from a nearby corral and chickens scratching in the dust near the barn. In the distance, cattle grazed on hillsides dotted with live oak and cedar. The landscape reminded her painfully of Bavaria, of rolling hills and wide skies, and a childhood that felt like it belonged to a different person in a different lifetime. Marie Fisher stood close to Anna, seeking unconscious protection from the older woman, though they had met only weeks earlier during transport. At 19, Marie was the youngest of the prisoners, and she looked even younger, with blonde hair that caught the sunlight and blue eyes that still carried traces of the girl she had been before the war consumed everything. She had been a nurse's assistant in a field hospital, working 18-hour shifts to tend wounded soldiers who arrived in waves after each battle, each retreat, each desperate stand against the Allied advance. Her capture had come when their hospital unit was overrun during a chaotic withdrawal. One moment she was changing bandages on a dying lieutenant who kept calling for his mother. The next, American medics were taking over, speaking English she could not understand, but using the same gentle hands on the same wounded men. They had treated her kindly during the initial confusion, given her water and food and blankets. But then came the processing and the categorization, and the long journey to this alien land where winter felt wrong and the stars at night formed unfamiliar patterns. The journey to America had been a blur of ships, trains, and processing centers where she understood nothing of what was being said to her. Now she stood in this vast landscape, feeling the weight of distance and displacement pressing on her chest until breathing became a conscious effort. Captain Williams began speaking, his voice carrying across the assembled group with practiced authority. Robert Harrison would provide accommodation in the converted bunkhouse. The women would work on the ranch in exchange for their keep under constant supervision. Standard protocols would be observed. No fraternization with civilian personnel beyond what work required. Monthly inspections to ensure compliance with Geneva Convention standards. As the captain spoke, Anna quietly translated for those whose English was limited or non-existent. Her voice was soft but clear, and several of the women glanced at her with surprise, not having known she possessed this skill. She met their eyes briefly, then looked away, uncomfortable with any role that suggested leadership or responsibility. She had followed leaders before. She understood now where that led. Robert's foreman emerged from the barn, and the tableau shifted again. James Mitchell was 38 years old, though the sun and wind had carved lines into his face that made him look older. Everyone called him Cole, a nickname from childhood that had stuck through decades of ranch work across Montana and Wyoming before he drifted south to Texas 5 years earlier. He was a widower. His wife lost to fever in their second year of marriage, and he had never remarried, pouring his capacity for care into horses and cattle and the steady work of keeping a ranch running through seasons and years. Cole surveyed the scene with the quiet assessment that came naturally to men who worked with animals and understood that observation revealed more than questions. These women confused him. They were supposed to be the enemy soldiers who had served the same regime that killed American boys overseas, including boys he had known, boys from towns he had worked in, boys who would never come home. Yet watching them stand in the cold afternoon air, waiting for work assignments with faces carefully blank, he saw nothing threatening. Only young women far from home trying to survive circumstances they probably never chose. Danny Cooper felt differently. At 26, he was the youngest of the regular ranch hands, and his anger sat close to the surface, ready to ignite at any provocation. His brother David had been killed at Normandy just 5 months earlier, cut down on a beach in France by German machine gun fire. The telegram had arrived in July, and Danny had carried the rage of that loss every day since, wearing it like a second skin that he could not shed and was not sure he wanted to. Now he was expected to work alongside German women, to share the same space, perhaps even speak to them. The thought made his jaw clench until his teeth ached. He avoided looking directly at the prisoners, afraid of what he might say or do if he allowed himself to acknowledge their humanity. Better to think of them as abstractions, as representatives of the regime that murdered his brother, than as individual people with their own stories and losses. Wei Chang observed it all with the patient understanding of someone who had spent his life navigating the space between cultures. His parents had immigrated from China to work on the railroad construction that carved through mountains and across deserts, breaking their backs so their children might have better lives. Wei had grown up hearing two languages, belonging fully to neither world, learning early that survival often meant being quiet and useful, and never quite visible enough to become a target. He understood what it meant to be viewed with suspicion, to have your loyalty questioned simply because of where your ancestors were born. When he looked at the German women, he saw that same careful wariness in their eyes, the constant awareness of being watched and judged. He had felt that awareness his entire life. It created a kinship he did not speak about, but recognized nonetheless. The women were shown to the converted bunkhouse, a long wooden structure that had once housed seasonal ranch hands during cattle drives and roundups. Military cots lined the walls, and a pot-bellied stove squatted in the center, its warmth barely reaching the corners where cold seeped through gaps in the boards. The accommodation was basic, but far better than many prisoners received. There were real mattresses on the cots, blankets that smelled of cedar, storage windows that let in light, and a separate washroom with running water piped from the ranch well. The women organized themselves with military efficiency, creating invisible boundaries between bunks and speaking only in hushed German during the brief moments when guards were not present. They moved through their routines like ghosts present, but not truly there, their faces carefully blank, with the expression of people who had learned that showing emotion invited vulnerability. Charlotte Weber was among the most observant of the group. At 26, she had worked in administrative offices in Hamburg, filing reports and processing paperwork for departments whose actual functions she had never questioned. She kept a diary hidden in her belongings, a small notebook where she recorded observations in tiny handwriting that covered every available space on each page. She noted everything: the layout of the ranch, the personalities of their captors, the gradual shift from autumn toward winter, the way the light changed as days shortened. That first night, lying in her cot and listening to the wind rattle loose boards, she wrote by candlelight. November 12, 1944. Arrived at Texas Ranch. Accommodation better than expected. Americans seem wary but not cruel. One young cowboy watches us with hatred. The old woman watches us with something I cannot name. Pity, curiosity. The landscape here reminds me of home, which makes the distance feel both shorter and infinitely longer. Work assignments began the following morning. The women were given tasks that required little communication: washing dishes in the main house kitchen, hauling water, mending fence posts under supervision, tending chickens, hanging laundry. They worked without complaint, their movements efficient and precise, conditioned by military service to complete assigned tasks, regardless of personal feelings about those tasks. Anna found herself assigned to kitchen work alongside Margaret Harrison. The old woman spoke limited German, rusty from decades of disuse, but she managed enough to communicate basic instructions. Peel these potatoes, wash these dishes, chop these vegetables for stew. The work was simple, almost meditative, giving Anna's hands something to do while her mind circled the same questions that had haunted her since capture. What had happened to her parents in Munich? The city had been heavily bombed. She knew that much from newspapers the guards sometimes left lying around. Whole neighborhoods destroyed. Had her parents survived, fled? Were they buried in rubble, or had they burned in the firestorms that turned cities into ovens? She had written letters through Red Cross channels. Careful letters that revealed nothing of her true circumstances, only assurances that she was alive and well. She had received no response. Each day without word made the silence more ominous. Marie was assigned to 10 injured animals, work that suited her nurse's training. A calf had been gored by a bull during breeding season, infection setting into the wound despite initial treatment. She cleaned it with supplies Cole provided her hands, remembering field hospital routines her voice soft as she murmured comfort in German to an animal that did not understand her words but responded to her gentle touch. Liesel Braun gravitated naturally toward the horses. At 22, she had grown up on a farm in Bavaria, working with draft horses that pulled plows and wagons and carried loads up mountain paths. She moved among the ranch horses with calm confidence, her hands gentle but firm, as she brushed their coats and checked their hooves for stones or damage. The animals responded to her in ways they sometimes did not respond, even to experienced cowboys, sensing something trustworthy in her quiet presence. Wei Cheng noticed this immediately and began working alongside her, teaching her English words for different tools and tasks while learning German terms in return. Their conversations were broken and simple, more gesture and demonstration than actual dialogue, but they communicated through shared purpose and mutual respect for the animals in their care. The ranch hands kept their distance at first. Cole had clear instructions from Robert Harrison to treat the prisoners fairly, but maintain appropriate separation. No unnecessary conversation, no personal questions. Complete assigned work and return the women to their quarters. Professional conduct at all times. But Danny's conduct was anything but professional. On the third day, he served spoiled meat for the prisoners' evening meal, claiming it was an accident when Cole caught him scraping mold from beef that had gone bad. The confrontation erupted in the barn voices, rising tension that had been building since the women's arrival finally breaking surface. "My brother died fighting these Nazis," Danny said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "And now we are supposed to feed them fresh food while David rots in a grave in France." Cole blocked his path, standing between Danny and the door, with the kind of physical presence that came from years of handling horses and cattle, and occasionally men who needed handling. "Your brother died fighting evil," he said quietly. "Not fighting these particular women. He died fighting a regime that told people they had to obey without question, had to hate without reason, had to follow orders even when those orders led to horror. You know what honors David's sacrifice? Showing these women that freedom means choosing kindness over hate, mercy over revenge. That is what makes us different from the regime he died fighting against." Danny threw a punch telegraphed and clumsy with rage. Cole caught his wrist, twisted, and pinned him against the barn wall with practiced efficiency. "You want to hit someone? Hit me. But leave those women alone. They have suffered enough." The fight went out of Danny like air from a punctured tire. He sagged against the wall and, for the first time since the telegram arrived in July, he began to cry. Great heaving sobs that shook his shoulders and made sounds he could not control. Cole held him the way a brother might, letting the grief pour out in a space where no one else could see it, understanding that sometimes rage was just sorrow wearing a different face. Margaret appeared in the barn doorway, a pot of fresh stew in her hands. She had been making it while the confrontation unfolded, moving with the efficiency of someone who had cooked for ranch hands for 50 years. Without a word, she walked to the bunkhouse and served the meal herself, ladling generous portions into tin bowls and meeting each woman's eyes with steady acknowledgement of their shared humanity. The women ate in silence, confused by the conflicting signals. Spoiled meat replaced by fresh stew. Young cowboys' hatred countered by old woman's kindness. Nothing made sense according to what they had been taught about Americans, about enemies, about what happened to prisoners in a foreign land. That night, Charlotte wrote in her diary, by candlelight, November 15th, 1944. "The young cowboy tried to poison us. The old one stopped him. The grandmother fed us herself. I do not understand this place. In Germany, everything was clear. Here, nothing is. Perhaps that is what freedom looks like. Confusion, choice, the possibility that people might be kind, even when they have every reason to be cruel." The days settled into routine. Mornings began before dawn when frost still sparkled on the grass and breath made clouds in the cold air. The women rose dressed in the extra work clothes Margaret had provided and moved through assignments that became familiar through repetition. Kitchen work, animal care, fence mending, laundry, vegetable garden preparation for spring planting. Tasks that kept hands busy and minds occupied with immediate concerns rather than dwelling on the enormous questions that had no answers. November became December. The landscape transformed gradually. Live oaks keeping their leaves while other trees went bare. Grass turning golden brown, cold settling deeper as days shortened. The women had been at the ranch for 3 weeks when the mail arrived. Captain Williams came with a canvas bag filled with letters that had been processed through military channels, and Red Cross routing systems overwhelmed by millions of displaced people trying to find lost family members. The German women gathered in the bunkhouse as he called names, hoping to hear their own praying for some word from the homes and families they had left behind months or even years earlier. 3 letters total for 23 women. Marie Fisher heard her name and stepped forward, accepting an envelope with hands that trembled. The return address was her aunt's, a small village near Hamburg. She tore it open and began reading, her lips moving silently as she absorbed each word. Then her face crumbled and she began to cry. Great heaving sobs that shook her thin shoulders and made sounds of anguish that needed no translation. Liesel moved to her side, immediately wrapping an arm around the younger woman, while Anna gently took the letter to read what had caused such devastation. The news was as terrible as they had feared. Marie's parents and younger brother had been killed in a bombing raid on Berlin in August. The apartment building where they lived had taken a direct hit. Her aunt had only learned of it weeks later when she made the dangerous journey to the city, searching for news of her sister's family. Charlotte received word from a cousin in Hamburg. Her home had been destroyed during the firestorm raids. Her mother was living in a refugee center in the countryside survival, but not truly living, existing in the ruins of everything familiar. Her father's fate remained unknown. He had been drafted into the Volkssturm, the last desperate mobilization of old men and young boys to defend Germany's borders. No one had heard from him since October. The cousin's letter was brief and factual, but between the lines Charlotte read desperation and hunger and the complete collapse of the world she had known. Anna received nothing. The silence felt heavier than any bad news could have been because it left room for imagination to create scenarios worse than reality. Her parents could be dead, displaced, unable to send mail through the chaos of a collapsing Germany. Munich had been bombed repeatedly, whole districts reduced to rubble. She stood by the window after the mail call, staring at the Texas landscape without seeing it, her mind 8,000 miles away in a city that might no longer exist. The women's grief hung over the ranch like smoke from a distant fire, invisible but present, coloring everything. Even Danny noticed it, though he tried not to. He saw Marie's hollow eyes, the way she moved through chores like a sleepwalker, and something in his chest tightened despite his determination to feel nothing but justified anger. 3 weeks passed. December brought the first real cold temperatures, dropping below freezing at night, turning morning water buckets into solid ice that had to be broken before animals could drink. The women huddled around the pot-bellied stove in the bunkhouse, wearing every layer they owned, their breath visible in the air between stove and walls. Margaret noticed and spoke to Robert. The women need proper winter coats. What they have is inadequate. We are housing enemy prisoners, not running a charity. Robert replied, though his tone suggested he was arguing with himself more than with his mother. They are young women far from home in a Texas winter, Margaret said firmly. Would you have David or Michael's enemies treat them so poorly if positions were reversed? Robert ordered wool coats from the Mercantile in Fredericksburg. When they arrived, Margaret distributed them herself, meeting each woman's surprised gratitude with a nod that acknowledged but did not dwell on the gesture. Kindness did not require fanfare. It simply required doing what was right when opportunities arose. It happened on a Thursday afternoon in late November, 3 weeks after the women's arrival, though it felt like both longer and shorter time becoming elastic under the weight of displacement and uncertainty. Cole Mitchell had been working since dawn repairing fence line in the north pasture, where cattle had pushed through during a storm, and he returned to the barn kitchen with an idea that had been forming in his mind for days. He had watched the German women move through their routines with mechanical precision, never smiling, never speaking unless necessary, their faces holding the carefully blank expression he had seen in horses that had been broken too hard. Still obedient, still functional, but with something vital damaged inside them. His grandmother back in Montana had always said that no problem existed that could not be helped by good food and kindness. He figured it was worth testing her theory. He gathered ingredients from Margaret's pantry with her silent but approving observation. Apples from the root cellar stored from the fall harvest and still crisp despite months of storage. Flour and sugar and the precious cinnamon that Margaret kept in a tin above the stove, brought back from San Antonio on supply runs and hoarded for special occasions. Butter churned that morning, still soft and yellow and smelling of cream. Cole had learned to bake during long winters on isolated Montana ranches, where a man either learned to cook or ate poorly for months on end. His specialty was apple cobbler, a recipe his grandmother had taught him when he was barely tall enough to see over the counter, her hands guiding his through each step until muscle memory took over and he could make it blind. He peeled apples with his pocket knife, the same blade he used for everything from cutting rope to trimming horse hooves to opening letters. The familiar motion was almost meditative, each apple skin coming away in long curls that fell into a bucket for the pigs. He cut the fruit into chunks, tossed them with sugar and cinnamon and a splash of vanilla extract that Margaret produced from her collection of cooking essentials. The smell began to fill the kitchen as the cobbler baked sweet and warm with cinnamon and butter, and the particular fragrance that fresh apples released when heat broke down their flesh. The aroma drifted through open windows, carried by afternoon breeze across the yard to where the women were working, hanging laundry on lines stretched between posts. Liesel noticed it first stopping mid-motion with a sheet in her hands. She inhaled deeply, and for a moment her carefully maintained neutral expression cracked. The scent reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen in Bavaria, of Christmas markets and childhood safety, in a world where the most difficult decision was whether to have one slice of apple cake or two. She said something in German to Anna, who also paused, her nose lifting, like a deer sensing something on the wind. Other women stopped their work, drawn by the smell of something that spoke to memory more than hunger, though they were hungry too. Always hungry despite adequate rations. Hunger had become a constant companion since the war began gnawing at them, even when their stomachs were full. When Cole carried the cobbler outside on a wooden tray, the pan still steaming from the oven, he felt suddenly foolish. What was he doing? These were enemy prisoners, not guests at a church social. But he had committed to the action, and Cole Mitchell was not a man who turned back once he had started down a path, even when that path revealed itself to be more complicated than initially apparent. He approached the group of women who had gathered near the clothesline, their eyes following the tray, with unmistakable hunger and something else. Longing, recognition. The particular pain that comes from smelling something that reminds you of home when home is 8,000 miles away and might not exist anymore. In his rough, simple English, slowed down, so they might understand, he said the words that would later become legendary on the ranch, repeated in stories told to children and grandchildren decades later. Apple cobbler, still hot, figured you might like some. The women stared at him, then at the cobbler, then at each other. None of them moved. They had been trained not to accept anything without suspicion, to maintain distance and dignity, even in imprisonment. To remember that accepting kindness from enemies could be a trap or a test, or a way to establish obligations that would be called due later. But Marie was 19 years old and had not yet learned the hardened caution that came with age and experience. The smell of cinnamon and apples overwhelmed her training. Her discipline, everything except the memory of her mother's kitchen and the aching homesickness that had lived in her chest since capture, made worse by the letter that confirmed she could never go home to what had been because it existed only in memory now. She approached Cole with small, hesitant steps, her hands clasped in front of her, like a child asking permission for something she wanted desperately, but was not sure she deserved. He handed her a tin plate with a generous portion still warm enough that she had to hold it carefully to avoid burning her fingers. She whispered donkey so quietly he almost missed it, then raised the first bite to her mouth. The taste hit her like a physical blow. Sweet apples and cinnamon and butter, and the particular texture of cobbler topping, crispy on top and soft underneath, everything combining to create something that was more than the sum of its ingredients. It tasted like safety, like childhood, like a world where people were kind without requiring anything in return. She began crying while she ate, tears running down her cheeks and dripping onto the plate, mixing with the cobbler in a way that embarrassed her, but she could not stop. Then the others came forward one by one, Anna maintaining her dignity but unable to hide the hunger in her eyes. Liesel smiling for the first time in months, a real smile that changed her entire face. Charlotte mentally recording every detail for her diary because this moment felt important in ways she did not yet understand. Greta her pragmatic defenses, lowering just enough to accept that not every gesture had hidden motivations. They ate standing in the Texas afternoon November sun, warm on their shoulders despite approaching winter. For the first time since their arrival, something like peace settled over the Harrison Ranch. Not happiness exactly, because happiness required more than a momentary relief from constant vigilance, but peace, a suspension of hostility, a recognition that perhaps enemies were just people standing on different sides of lines drawn by others. Danny watched from the barn doorway, fury and confusion warring on his face. His brother was dead because of these women's country, their government, their war. And here was Cole giving them dessert like they were neighbors who had stopped by for a visit. It felt wrong. It felt like betrayal. But watching Marie cry while she ate, seeing the others accept small plates of cobbler with trembling hands and whispered thanks, he felt something crack in the armor of his rage. They looked like his sister might look if positions were reversed. Young and scared and trying to survive something they never chose. The realization did not make his anger disappear. David was still dead. That fact remained unchangeable. But the anger became more complicated, less pure, infected with the understanding that the world was not as simple as he needed it to be. Robert Harrison watched from his office window, observing the scene with the careful assessment he applied to all ranch operations. He had been prepared to intervene if Cole was being too familiar with the prisoners, but something in the moment made him reconsider his rigid approach to managing the camp. These women were not hardened soldiers. They were displaced people caught in circumstances beyond their control. Treating them with basic human decency did not compromise security or betray American values. It might even make the challenging situation more manageable for everyone involved. That evening, he called Cole and Captain Williams to his office. New assignments, he announced. The prisoners could work with the horses, help with injured cattle, join communal meals when appropriate. They would still be supervised, still be maintained under Geneva Convention protocols, but the rigid separation would be relaxed where practical work required collaboration. Captain Williams hesitated, citing regulations and protocols and the importance of maintaining clear boundaries between captors and captives. But Margaret entered the office during the discussion, and her presence shifted the dynamic in ways that military rank and male authority could not. Geneva Convention says treat prisoners humanely, she observed quietly. Last I checked, humanity includes kindness, not just avoiding torture. These girls are somebody's daughters. Would we want our boys treated with such rigid coldness if they were captured? Or would we hope that somewhere in the world someone might show them unexpected mercy? January 15th, 1945. Reverend Thomas Schmidt arrived at the Harrison Ranch carrying newspapers that weighed more than their physical mass should account for. He was 68 years old, a German immigrant who had come to Texas in 1895 and built a life in Fredericksburg, serving a congregation that included both old German families and newer American settlers. The war had complicated his position in ways that kept him awake at night, wrestling with questions of loyalty and identity, and how to be both German and American when those identities seemed to demand opposite allegiances. He had developed a routine of visiting the ranch weekly, providing spiritual guidance to the prisoners in their own language, hearing confessions, and offering prayers in German that sounded like home to women who desperately needed some connection to what they had lost. But today he brought more than comfort. He brought truth. Captain Williams met him at the main house, and together they approached Robert and Margaret with heavy hearts and heavier news. The newspapers showed photographs that would haunt the world for generations. Headlines screamed in bold type about death camps liberated by Allied forces pushing into Germany from both east and west. Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau. Names that meant nothing to most Americans but would become synonymous with industrial-scale evil. The photographs showed skeletal figures in striped uniforms, mass graves filled with bodies stacked like cordwood gas chambers disguised as shower rooms, and mountains of personal belongings stripped from murdered prisoners. Eyeglasses, shoes, hair, the detritus of millions of lives systematically destroyed. Captain Williams initially hesitated to allow the women access to these newspapers, concerned about how such information might affect camp security and morale. The prisoners were already dealing with grief over lost families and destroyed homes. Adding the weight of collective guilt for atrocities they may not have known about seemed cruel, potentially destabilizing. But Margaret intervened with quiet firmness. They have a right to know what was done in their country's name, she told her son. If we keep the truth from them, we become no better than the regime that lied to them in the first place. Knowledge is the beginning of accountability. Without it, there can be no genuine atonement or growth. The newspapers were placed in the bunkhouse common area, and the women gathered around them like witnesses to a terrible accident, unable to look away despite the horror before their eyes. Anna read the articles aloud in German, her voice steady at first, but growing more strained with each paragraph. The reports detailed camps with names that meant nothing to most of the women at first. Just places, just words. But the numbers made them more than places. Not hundreds, not thousands, millions. 6 million Jews murdered in a systematic campaign of genocide that involved trains and schedules and bureaucratic efficiency. Roma people, political prisoners, disabled individuals, homosexuals, anyone deemed undesirable by the regime, all fed into an industrial machinery of death that operated with the precision of a factory and the coldness of a slaughterhouse. The scale was incomprehensible. Human minds were not built to grasp such numbers. One death is a tragedy, someone once said. 1 million is a statistic. But these women were German. These murders had been committed by their countrymen, their government people who spoke their language and shared their culture. The guilt was not abstract, it was immediate and crushing and inescapable. Some of the women began to weep. Others sat in stunned silence, faces blank with shock. A few protested that it must be propaganda, allied lies designed to demonize Germany and justify the war's continuation. But the photographs made denial difficult. The evidence was too detailed, too consistent across multiple sources, too obviously real in its horror. Charlotte's hands shook as she held one of the newspapers. She thought about her service in Hamburg, filing reports and processing documents in military administrative offices. Had she been part of this machinery of death without knowing it? The forms she had typed and filed, had they been connected to these camps, to this systematic destruction of human life? She felt nauseated, dizzy with implications and questions she had never thought to ask while serving what she believed was her country's legitimate defense. Liesel, who had operated radio equipment, transmitting military communications, wondered what messages she had helped relay. Had some of her transmissions coordinated the transport of prisoners to these death camps? The guilt was crushing, made worse by the knowledge that she had never questioned, never looked beyond her immediate duties to wonder what larger purpose they served. Anna sat silent, her mind working through calculations that became more horrible with each iteration. She had operated communications equipment in occupied France. How many of her transmissions had been orders? How many had been reports about resistance movements that resulted in arrests? How many people had died because she efficiently performed her job without asking what that job was actually accomplishing? The newspapers created a crisis of conscience that spread through the group like infection. The women had already been dealing with grief over lost families and destroyed homes. Now they faced the additional burden of collective guilt for atrocities committed in their names, while they claimed ignorance. Ignorance that might be technically true, but felt morally insufficient as a defense. Eva, the oldest at 28 and usually the most pragmatic, spoke into the heavy silence. "We cannot have known," she said in German. "We were soldiers. We followed orders. That is what soldiers do. This is Allied propaganda designed to make us feel guilty for serving our country." But even as she said it, her voice lacked conviction. The photographs were too real. The testimony from survivors too consistent. The evidence too overwhelming. Anna responded quietly, her words careful but firm. "Not knowing does not erase responsibility. We chose not to ask questions. We chose to believe what was convenient. We chose to look away when looking might have revealed uncomfortable truths. That was a choice. Our choice." The debate continued through the evening, voices rising and falling, some women defending themselves and Germany, others collapsing under the weight of recognition that they had been part of something monstrous, whether they directly participated or simply failed to resist. That night, Charlotte wrote in her diary by candlelight, her handwriting shaky. January 15th, 1945. "We learned today what Germany truly did. What we did because we are Germany, whether we knew or not. Millions murdered while we typed reports and transmitted messages and filed paperwork and told ourselves we were just following orders, just doing our jobs, just trying to survive. I thought I was a secretary. I think now I was a cog in a murder machine. How do you live with that? How do you wake up each morning knowing you may have helped kill people you never saw, never knew, never even thought about?" The women sank into depression over the weeks following the revelations. They moved through their work like hollow shells, present physically but absent in every meaningful way. The progress that had been made since the apple cobbler incident, the small steps toward normal human interaction, all seemed to evaporate in the face of this new knowledge. Margaret observed this spiral with concern, born of experience. She had lived long enough to understand that guilt without redemption would destroy people completely, eating them from the inside until nothing remained but emptiness and despair. Knowledge of wrong without path toward atonement was a recipe for spiritual death. She approached Robert with a proposal that shocked him, even though he should have anticipated it, knowing his mother as he did. She wanted to invite the German women to share Thanksgiving dinner at the main ranch house table. Not as prisoners, not as employees, as guests. The idea seemed absurd to Robert, potentially dangerous, certain to cause controversy if word spread to neighboring ranches or into town. These were enemy prisoners of war, not dinner guests. The calendar had turned past Thanksgiving already, but Margaret insisted they could have a delayed celebration, make it a special occasion for late January, when winter work slowed and time allowed proper preparation. But Margaret was persistent in the way only mothers can be with adult children, wearing down resistance through combination of reason and moral authority. She reminded him that they claimed to represent Christian values, American hospitality, the principles that supposedly distinguished them from the regime they were fighting. If those claims meant anything, they had to be demonstrated through actions, not just words. If we feed them like prisoners but never treat them like people, she said quietly, we become no better than those who ran the camps. They are mourning. We have the opportunity to show these women what freedom actually looks like, what mercy actually means. Not as weakness, but as strength. Not as surrender, but as the highest form of victory, proving that our values survive, even when tested by the presence of enemies. The announcement came 3 days before the planned feast. Captain Williams gave reluctant approval after Margaret personally guaranteed there would be no security concerns. The women would be invited in small groups to the main house where they would share a meal with the Harrison family and the ranch hands. It would be an American Thanksgiving feast, delayed by circumstances, but no less meaningful for that delay. The invitation was presented to the prisoners during their evening roll call, and the response was stunned silence. Anna, serving as translator, had to repeat the message twice before the women fully understood what was being offered. Several began to cry, immediately overwhelmed by unexpected kindness that violated everything they had been taught about how enemies treated captives. Others looked suspicious, wondering what would be demanded of them in return for this privilege, unable to believe that generosity could exist without strings attached. Thanksgiving morning arrived cold and clear, with frost covering the prairie grass like scattered diamonds. Margaret had been cooking for 2 days, preparing a feast that would feed 24 people. Robert had slaughtered one of their finest turkeys, and the bird roasted slowly in the kitchen oven, filling the house with aromas that made even the cowboys weak with anticipation. Cole had baked 3 apple cobblers, his signature contribution, now eagerly anticipated by everyone on the ranch. The first cobbler had broken something, created possibility where none had existed before. These 3 would hopefully continue that work, building on foundation already laid. Wei Chang had prepared a special dish taught to him by his mother, adapting traditional flavors to available ingredients in a gesture that honored his own heritage while participating in this American tradition. The green beans he brought to the table carried ginger and garlic and sesame oil, ingredients his mother had carried from China and cultivated in her Texas garden, preserving taste memories across oceans and generations. The long wooden table in the main house dining room had been extended to its full length, a construction of oak that Robert's father had built to accommodate large gatherings during holidays and celebrations. It could seat 24 people when fully extended, and today it would hold exactly that number. Margaret had covered it with white linen tablecloths, set it with mismatched plates collected over decades, and placed wildflowers in mason jars as centerpieces. The first group of women arrived at noon, escorted by guards who were instructed to remain outside. Marie, Anneliesel, Charlotte, and 4 others stepped into the main house with visible nervousness, their hands clasped in front of them, their eyes taking in the warmth and comfort of a real home. They had been in the bunkhouse for months, a structure that was functional but institutional. This was different. This was someone's life, someone's history, visible in the photographs on walls, in the worn furniture, and the particular smell that homes acquired over decades of cooking and living. Margaret greeted them at the door, speaking in her rusty German and gesturing them toward the table. Robert stood at the head uncomfortable but committed to the decision once made. Cole and Way and the other ranch hands took their places, maintaining awkward distance that politeness required, but closeness wanted to overcome. Danny sat at the far end, jaw tight, having agreed to attend only after Cole made it clear that his presence was expected, not optional. The meal began with Robert saying grace, a simple prayer, thanking God for food and safety, and asking blessing on those gathered, regardless of the circumstances that brought them together. Anna quietly translated for others, and several of the women bowed their heads respectfully, despite their own complicated relationships with faith and divine providence. Then food was passed, and for several minutes the only sounds were plates being filled and quiet murmurs of appreciation. The turkey was perfectly roasted, golden brown skin crackling, as Cole carved it with practiced efficiency. The dressing was savory with sage and cornbread and pecans. Sweet potatoes were mashed with butter and brown sugar. Green beans carried ginger's bite and sesame's nuttiness. Cranberry sauce added tart sweetness. Fresh bread, still warm from the oven, filled gaps on plates already overloaded. The initial silence gave way gradually to conversation. Margaret asked Marie about her nursing training, and the young woman began speaking hesitantly about her work in field hospitals, the challenge of limited supplies, the terrible improvisation required when proper medicine was unavailable. Margaret shared stories of frontier medicine, delivering babies with boiled water, and prayers treating wounds with whatever was at hand, developing the kind of practical knowledge that came from necessity rather than formal training. Cole asked Liesel about horses in Germany, and she described Bavaria, the draft horses her family used on their farm, the particular challenges of mountain terrain and winter weather. Wei shared stories of his parents' journey from China, the horses they worked with during railroad construction, the way animals transcended language and culture because they responded to kindness and consistency regardless of the nationality of the person providing it. Even Danny listened, though he said nothing, his plate emptying slowly while his jaw remained tight and his eyes stayed fixed on his food rather than meeting anyone's gaze. But he was present. That counted for something. The climax of the feast came when Margaret brought out dessert. 3 apple cobblers still warm from the oven, their tops golden brown and crusted with sugar. Pecan pies, a Texas tradition that carried the particular sweetness of the South. Fresh cream churned that morning and whipped until it formed soft peaks that melted slowly on warm cobbler. As they ate dessert, Anna gathered her courage and asked the question that had been building in her mind throughout the meal. "Mrs. Harrison," she said carefully, her English better than she usually revealed, "why are you being so kind to us?" Table fell silent. All eyes turned to Margaret, waiting for her answer. The old woman set down her fork and looked at Anna with eyes that had witnessed 7 decades of joy and sorrow, triumph and loss, human kindness and human cruelty. "Because the war will end, child," she said quietly. "Hate can win battles, but only mercy can win peace. My husband died 10 years ago, and I learned then that holding on to anger just makes the burden heavier. You girls did not start this war. You were used by it just like my boys who went to fight it. I cannot change what happened to you, but I can show you that not everyone in this world chooses cruelty. That is what I am doing, showing you what is possible when we choose differently." Marie began crying quietly, tears running down her face and dripping onto her plate. Anna blinked rapidly, fighting her own tears. Charlotte looked away, overwhelmed. Even Liesel, usually stoic, had to wipe her eyes with her napkin. Danny stood abruptly and left the table, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. The moment shattered, but what it had created remained hanging in the air, like the smell of apple cobbler and cinnamon. Cole found Danny in the barn 20 minutes later, slamming tools around with violence that spoke to inner turmoil. The confrontation that had been building for months finally erupted. "How can you sit there eating with them like they are family?" Danny demanded, his voice breaking. "David is dead because of them. Dead at 19 on a beach in France, shot by German machine guns, buried in a military cemetery 8,000 miles from home. And we are supposed to share Thanksgiving dinner. Supposed to smile and pass the potatoes. Supposed to pretend everything is fine." Cole let him finish, understanding that some things needed to be said before they could be released. Then he responded with the calm firmness that came from his own hard-won wisdom. "David died fighting evil," he said quietly, "not fighting these particular women. He died fighting a regime that told people they had to obey without question, had to hate without reason, had to follow orders even when those orders led to horror. You know what honors David's sacrifice, showing these women that freedom means choosing kindness over hate, mercy over revenge, proving that our values survive even when tested by the presence of enemies. That is what makes us different from the regime he died fighting. That is what makes his death mean something instead of just being another statistic in a war that has produced too many statistics. The argument escalated. Danny threw a punch, telegraphed and clumsy with rage and grief. Cole blocked it, caught his wrist twisted, and pinned him against the barn wall with practiced efficiency, born of years handling horses and cattle, and occasionally men who needed handling. You want to hit someone? Cole said, his voice still calm despite the physical confrontation. Hit me, but leave those women alone. They have suffered enough. They have lost everything just like you lost David. The difference is they are still here, still trying to survive, still carrying the weight of what their country did. That takes courage, maybe more courage than dying on a beach. Maybe David would understand that. Maybe he would want you to show them what he died defending. The possibility of mercy even in the face of justified anger. Danny collapsed, sagging against the wall. For the second time since David's telegram arrived, he began to cry great heaving sobs that shook his shoulders and made sounds he could not control. Cole held him, not as employee and employer, but as two men who had both lost people they loved and understood that grief sometimes needed witness more than solutions. They stood that way for long minutes while the Texas afternoon faded toward evening and the smell of Thanksgiving feast drifted from the main house on cold wind. Eventually, Danny's crying subsided into shudders, then quiet breathing, then exhausted calm. I do not know how to stop being angry, he said finally. You do not have to stop being angry, Cole replied. You just have to decide what to do with that anger. You can let it poison you. Let it turn you into something David would not recognize or would not be proud of. Or you can use it as fuel to become the kind of man who honors his memory by living up to the values he died defending. Your choice. But choose carefully because the choice will determine who you become and whether his death means something or just makes you bitter. February brought word that repatriation procedures were being formalized for German prisoners across the United States. The war in Europe was entering its final phase with Allied forces advancing on Berlin from both East and West Soviet armies, pushing through Poland and Germany, while British and American forces moved through France and into the Rhineland. German defeat was no longer a question of if, but when. Weeks at most. Maybe days. Captain Williams received detailed instructions from the War Department outlining the process by which prisoners would be returned to their homeland once hostilities officially ceased. Transportation schedules, processing centers, documentation requirements, medical examinations, security protocols, everything organized with military precision. He was required to inform the women at the Harrison Ranch that their captivity would soon end, that they would be free to return home within months. The announcement should have been received with joy and relief the prisoners' dream of freedom and homecoming finally realized. Instead, it triggered a crisis that none of the American staff had anticipated. The women gathered in the bunkhouse after the formal announcement, and for the first time since their arrival, voices were raised in heated debate. The conversation was entirely in German, rapid and emotional, with some women arguing passionately while others sat in troubled silence. The Americans could not understand the words, but could feel the intensity, the way the discussion became almost violent in its emotional urgency. Anna found herself at the center of the discussion, not because she sought leadership, but because the others looked to her for guidance in navigating this impossible choice. Her English was best. Her thinking was clearest. Her ability to articulate complex moral questions gave her authority she never wanted, but could not refuse. Return to what she asked the group, her voice carrying the weight of months spent grappling with questions that had no easy answers. Return to cities that no longer exist, to families we cannot locate, to a country that committed unspeakable crimes in our names while we claimed ignorance. What exactly are we returning to? Eva argued for return with pragmatic insistence. It is our duty, she said firmly. Our country needs people willing to rebuild, to atone, to help create something better from the ruins. We cannot abandon Germany because it committed sins. That would be the ultimate betrayal, leaving when we are needed most. But Charlotte was torn, her diary entries revealing internal conflict that kept her awake at night. Part of her felt that returning to Germany was a duty, that her country needed people willing to help rebuild, and atone for what had been done. But another part of her recognized that the Harrison Ranch had given her something she had never found in Germany: the freedom to question, to think independently, to become someone different than who she had been taught to be. The Americans had shown her what it meant to live without fear of expressing doubt or asking uncomfortable questions. Could she return to a culture that had punished such independence? Marie's situation was particularly heartbreaking. At 19, she had no family left to return to. The aunt who had written to inform her of her parents' death had made it clear in subsequent letters that she could barely feed herself, much less take in another mouth. Germany offered Marie nothing but memories of loss and a future of uncertainty in a devastated landscape where millions of displaced people competed for scarce resources and destroyed infrastructure, made survival itself a daily challenge. Yet the idea of staying in America, of choosing to remain with former enemies rather than return to help her countrymen, felt like the ultimate betrayal of her identity as a German. She spent hours each day working with the horses, finding in their quiet presence a peace that human conversation could not provide. Liesel often joined her in these silent vigils, the two young women communicating through shared grief more than words. The debate in the bunkhouse continued for days, the same arguments circling like buzzards over carrion. Eventually, Anna made a decision that would change everything. "I'm going to ask if we can stay," she announced quietly. The room fell silent. Even Eva, who had been arguing most passionately for return, looked shocked. Such a request violated every expectation, every protocol, every assumption about what prisoners wanted and what captors could provide. "You cannot be serious," Eva said finally. "They will never allow it. And even if they did, how could we live with ourselves? Choosing comfort over duty, choosing safety over solidarity with our people." Anna met her eyes steadily. "I am not choosing comfort," she said quietly. "I am choosing freedom. Real freedom. The kind that lets me think my own thoughts and ask my own questions and become something other than what I was told to be. That is what America has shown me is possible. That is what I want. What we all deserve, whether we return to Germany or stay here. The right to choose our own paths instead of having them chosen for us." March 1945. Anna approached Robert Harrison's office with hands that trembled despite her attempts at composure. She had been rehearsing this conversation for weeks, carefully choosing English words that would convey the complexity of what she needed to say, without revealing how terrified she was of rejection, of judgment, of asking for something so far outside normal bounds that she had no framework for even forming the request. Captain Williams was also present, having been summoned by Robert when he learned that Anna had requested a formal meeting. The two men sat behind the desk while Anna stood before them, her posture straight despite the nervousness evident in her eyes, and the way her fingers twisted together at her waist. She began speaking in careful, measured English that had improved dramatically over the months but still carried accent and occasional uncertainty about vocabulary. "Mr. Harrison, Captain Williams, I come to speak for some of us who cannot speak so well in English. We have a request that is very unusual, but we must ask it anyway. Please, you will listen with open minds." What followed was an explanation that neither man had expected. 7 of the 23 women wanted to formally request permission to remain in the United States rather than accept repatriation to Germany. Anna explained this reasoning with heartbreaking honesty, laying out arguments she had refined through weeks of internal debate and bunkhouse discussion. They had nowhere to return to, no families waiting, no homes standing, cities reduced to rubble, infrastructure destroyed, food scarce, winter coming, millions of displaced people competing for survival in landscape of destruction. What would they return to except misery and struggle and the weight of collective guilt for crimes they had not directly committed but had failed to prevent? More importantly, they had discovered in Wyoming something that Germany had never offered them: the freedom to think differently, to question authority, to become individuals rather than components of a collective ideology. The Harrison Ranch had shown them what it meant to live without constant fear of being reported for expressing doubt, without having to watch every word to ensure it conformed to acceptable thought. They wanted the chance to build new lives in America, to contribute to a society that had shown them unexpected mercy and kindness, despite having every reason to treat them harshly. They were prepared to work. Anna continued, her voice growing more confident as she found her rhythm. Prepared to prove themselves worthy of this extraordinary consideration. prepared to spend the rest of their lives earning the second chance they were requesting. They understood the complexity of what they asked. They knew there were no precedents, no established processes, but they were asking anyway because the alternative was returning to something that looked increasingly like death of the spirit, if not the body. Robert sat in stunned silence for a long moment after Anna finished speaking. He had never imagined that prisoners would ask to remain in captivity rather than accept their freedom. The request violated every assumption about how these situations worked, about what people wanted when offered the chance to return home. Captain Williams's expression revealed similar shock, though his military training helped him maintain composure. The legal and bureaucratic complications were staggering. These women were still technically enemy combatants, still subject to Geneva Convention protocols that mandated repatriation once hostilities ceased. There was no established process for what they were requesting, no precedent to follow, no clear authority to approve such an unusual petition. Yet both men recognized the profound courage it took for these women to make such a request, knowing they risked rejection in the judgment of both Germans and Americans for their choice. Anna stood before them, essentially asking to become refugees in enemy territory, to abandon their national identity in exchange for possibility of freedom in foreign land. "I need to think on this," Robert said finally. "Captain, what is your assessment from a military standpoint?" Captain Williams took a long breath before responding. "Legally, it is a nightmare. The Geneva Convention is clear about repatriation procedures. Allowing prisoners to refuse return sets dangerous precedent that could complicate future conflicts. The War Department will have concerns about security, about how this looks to public opinion, about the message it sends." He paused, then continued more quietly. "But morally, Mr. Harrison, these women are asking for what America claims to offer the world. Freedom and a second chance. They are asking to be measured by their individual choices rather than their national origin. Denying them feels like denying everything we say we are fighting for. I do not have authority to approve this request, but I will forward it through proper channels with my recommendation that it receive serious consideration rather than automatic rejection." The news spread through the ranch within hours, carried by guards and ranch hands who had overheard portions of the conversation. Reactions were mixed and passionate, dividing the small community in ways that previous months had not. Danny's anger, which had been slowly diminishing over the months, flared back to life. He confronted Cole in the barn, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "My brother died fighting these people, and now we are supposed to welcome them as neighbors. Give them the right to stay in our country while David is buried in a military cemetery in France. It is an insult to every American who sacrificed for this war." Cole listened without interrupting, understanding that Danny's pain was real and deserved space to be expressed. But when the younger cowboy finished, Cole responded with quiet firmness that carried authority beyond his position. "David died fighting evil," he said slowly, "not fighting these particular women. He died so that people could be free to choose who they want to become. Seems to me that honoring his sacrifice means giving people that choice, not denying it because we are angry about his death. These women are asking for freedom, which is what David believed in enough to die for. How do we honor him by denying them that?" The argument in the barn did not resolve anything, but it planted seeds that would germinate over coming weeks. Danny did not change his position immediately. Transformation rarely happens in single moments of revelation. More often, it comes gradually through accumulated, small recognitions that eventually shift perspective without announcing the change. The shift began on a March evening when Danny entered the barn late to check on a calf that had been injured during calving. The birth had been difficult, the calf pulled wrong, and damaged in ways that made survival uncertain. He expected the animal to be dying, was prepared to put it down quickly and cleanly, rather than let it suffer. Instead, he found Marie still there, working through the night, her hands bloody from lancing infection and treating wounds. She had remembered field hospital techniques, adapted them for animal care, and refused to give up despite exhaustion and the likely futility of her efforts. When Danny entered, she looked up with red eyes that revealed hours of crying mixed with hours of determined work. "I could not save my brother," she said in broken English, her voice rough with emotion. "This calf I must save. Have to save something." Danny stood frozen, watching her work with gentle competence despite her grief. He saw David in her determination. His brother had loved animals, spent hours nursing injured ranch dogs back to health, cried when calves died during difficult births. David had possessed gentleness that war had tried to harden, but never quite succeeded in destroying. He found himself moving forward without conscious decision, reaching for clean bandages and handing them to Marie silently. She looked up, shocked by the gesture, then accepted the supplies with a nod that acknowledged both his help and the significance of the moment. They worked together through the morning as gray dawn broke over Texas hills. The calf survived. When they finished, Danny spoke his first direct words to any of the German women since their arrival months earlier. "My brother," he said slowly, forcing the words past grief and anger and confusion. He would have done the same, worked all night to save an animal. He was gentle that way. Marie nodded, understanding more from his tone than his words. "I am sorry for your brother," she said quietly. "I am sorry for all the brothers and fathers and sons, on all sides. War takes too much from everyone. It was not forgiveness, not yet. But it was a beginning, a crack in the armor that Danny had built around his grief." He left the barn as sun rose higher, feeling something shift inside his chest, some burden becoming fractionally lighter in ways he did not yet understand but could not deny. April brought the legal hearing that would determine the women's fate. The War Department had agreed to consider the request, but insisted on formal proceedings in San Antonio where proper testimony could be recorded and legal framework established for any decision. 7 women petitioned for right to remain Anna Marie Liesel, Charlotte Eva, having changed her mind after weeks of internal struggle, and 2 others whose stories were quieter but no less desperate. The hearing room was military sparse long table at front, where 3 officers sat with files and regulations and the weight of unprecedented decision. Captain Williams testified first as supervising officer, describing the women's conduct during captivity, their work ethic, their integration into ranch operations, their demonstrated commitment to American values despite their German origins. "These women have been model prisoners," he stated clearly. "More than that, they have shown exceptional character in circumstances that tested them severely. They learned of their families' deaths with dignity. They processed the horror of Holocaust revelations with moral courage rather than denial. They have worked hard, caused no security concerns, and frankly, have integrated better into American society during their months at the Harrison Ranch than many immigrants do after years. Denying their petition contradicts everything we claim to represent as a nation." Robert Harrison testified next, speaking with the practical authority of someone who had managed the women's daily supervision. "I have run cattle for 30 years, he said plainly. "I know when an animal can be rehabilitated and when one cannot. I understand the difference between genuine transformation and performance designed to manipulate. These women are not performing. They are not manipulating. They are people who got caught in something bigger than themselves and have used their time here to become something different than what their government tried to make them. We have the chance to show the world what American mercy looks like. Whether we take that chance or reject it will say more about us than about them." Then Margaret Harrison took the stand and the room shifted. She walked slowly, using a cane for support, her 74 years evident in her gait, but her mind sharp as ever. She placed her hand on the Bible offered for swearing in, and her voice when she spoke carried the weight of 7 decades of experience with human nature at its best and worst. "Gentlemen," she began, "I am 74 years old. I have lived through 2 world wars, the Spanish flu, the Depression, and the loss of my husband. I have buried friends, raised children, and seen enough suffering to last 3 lifetimes. I know something about human nature, about evil and goodness, about who deserves second chances and who does not." She paused, gathering her thoughts, then continued with firm conviction. "These German girls came to our ranch as prisoners. We could have treated them as enemies, met their defeat with cruelty disguised as justice. But my Bible teaches me to love enemies, do good to those who hate you. Not because they deserve it, but because mercy is what separates civilization from barbarism. I have watched Anna Schmidt help me can vegetables for winter. I have seen Marie Fisher nurse injured animals with the same care she gave wounded soldiers. I have observed Liesel Braun gentle wild horses with patience and kindness. These women did not choose their government. They did not choose this war. But they are choosing. Now choosing freedom, choosing to build instead of destroy, choosing to be Americans in spirit before they are ever Americans on paper." Her voice grew stronger as emotion built. "My son died in the last war. I know the cost of conflict. I understand what it means to lose someone you love to violence that seems senseless. But I also know that peace does not come from revenge. It comes from having the courage to say the war is over, let healing begin. If we send these women back to a destroyed Germany, we prove that our talk of freedom and second chances is empty rhetoric. If we let them stay, we prove that America means what it says about being a refuge for those who seek liberty. We prove that mercy is not weakness, but strength, not surrender, but the highest form of victory. She fixed each officer with her steady gaze before finishing. I am asking you to show mercy, not for their sake, for ours. So we can look at ourselves in the mirror and know we chose kindness over cruelty, hope over hate, the difficult right over the easy wrong. Silence filled the room when Margaret finished. Even the stenographer had stopped typing, caught in the moment's wait. Then movement at the back of the room drew attention. Danny Cooper stood, having attended as observer without planning to participate. "May I speak?" he asked roughly. The tribunal hesitated, then nodded. Danny approached the front, hands shaking as he faced the officers and the assembled witnesses. His voice when he spoke was thick with emotion, barely controlled. "My name is Daniel Cooper. My brother David was killed at Normandy Beach on June 6, 1944. He was 19 years old. He loved animals and reading and the idea of America as a place where people could be free. He died believing in those things. When these women arrived at the Harrison Ranch, I hated them. I blamed them for David's death. I wanted them to suffer. I tried to poison their food. I tried to make their lives miserable. I believed that revenge would somehow make my grief less." He paused, wiping his eyes roughly. "But over these months, I watched them work. I saw them grieve for families they had lost. I witnessed them grapple with the horror of what their country did. I saw Marie spend 18 hours saving a dying calf because she could not save her brother and needed to save something. My brother would have done the same thing. He was gentle and kind even when the world was cruel. Letting these women stay does not dishonor David's sacrifice. It honors it. He died fighting a regime that said you had to hate people because of where they were born, that said individual choices did not matter, only collective identity. He died believing in freedom. Real freedom, which includes the freedom to change, to choose a different path, to become someone better than who you were taught to be." His voice broke completely, but he pushed through. "If we send them back out of revenge, we become the thing David died fighting against. If we let them stay, we prove his death meant something. We prove America is worth believing in, worth dying for, worth building with people who were once enemies but choose to become something else." He looked directly at the tribunal. "I am asking you to let them stay. For David. For all the boys who died believing America was the kind of place that would do the right thing even when it was hard. Please let them stay." The courtroom remained silent for long moments after Danny finished. Then the tribunal adjourned to deliberate, leaving everyone to wait in tension that stretched across hours. 2 weeks later, the decision was announced. The War Department approved the petition with conditions so extensive they essentially created a new category of immigration status. The women must remain under supervision for 2 years, must demonstrate integration into American society, must learn English fluently, must secure employment and housing, must pass security clearance annually, citizenship eligibility after 5 years not guaranteed, but possible pending review of conduct and contribution. The 7 women accepted immediately, signing documents that made their choice official and irreversible. They were free, but freedom came with strings-attached requirements that would shape their next decade. Greta and 2 others chose differently, deciding to return to Germany, despite the hardship awaiting them there. The farewell was emotional and complicated. 8 women who had shared captivity, now taking divergent paths that both required courage. They embraced with tears and promises to write, recognizing that both choices were valid. Both required sacrifice. Neither was inherently more noble than the other. Charlotte wrote in her diary that night, April 1945, "7 of us stay, 4 return. We will probably never see each other again. But we will always be sisters in survival, bonded by what we endured and what we chose when given the terrible gift of choice itself." The years that followed were hard in different ways than war had been hard. The women who stayed faced prejudice from some community members who could not separate them from the regime that had murdered millions. Whispered accusations of being Nazi sympathizers who had escaped justice. cold shoulders in stores, children throwing rocks, anonymous letters suggesting they leave Texas and go back where they belong. But they also found remarkable support from others who believed in redemption and second chances. Margaret Harrison became their fierce advocate, attending church with them and daring anyone to suggest they were unwelcome in God's house. Cole Mitchell taught them ranch skills that translated into employable capabilities. Wei Chang introduced them to other immigrants who understood the challenge of building new identity in adopted homeland. Anna remained at the Harrison Ranch working alongside Margaret in ranch administration. She learned bookkeeping, supply management, how to negotiate with buyers, and manage seasonal workers. Her English improved rapidly, accents softening, though never quite disappearing. Cole began teaching her to ride horses, patient lessons that developed slowly into friendship and eventually into something neither quite acknowledged on, but both felt. Marie trained as registered nurse hospital in San Antonio, accepting her under work visa that the immigration decision provided. Her field hospital experience proved invaluable in emergency rooms where trauma care required quick thinking and steady hands. She faced prejudice from some staff, but won respect through competence and the particular compassion that came from having witnessed suffering up close. Eventually, she specialized in pediatric trauma care, finding peace in helping children survive injuries that might have killed them in earlier times or different places. Liesel worked with Wei Chang, their partnership with horses deepening into romance that scandalized some community members. German woman and Chinese American man, both foreign, both suspect, both refusing to apologize for loving each other. They married in 1947, despite opposition's small ceremony at the ranch, with Margaret presiding and Cole serving as witness. They started their own horse breeding program, combining Liesel's European knowledge with Wei's understanding of local conditions and market demands. Charlotte opened translation service in San Antonio, using her language skills to help other immigrants navigate American bureaucracy. She understood better than most what it meant to arrive in strange country without understanding how systems worked, what forms required, what questions to ask. She charged modest fees and sometimes worked for free when clients could not pay, building reputation for honesty and competence that eventually made her business successful beyond her expectations. The women maintained connections with those who returned to Germany, informal network of letters that chronicled parallel journeys of reconstruction on both sides of the Atlantic. Greta's letters described finding her mother in refugee center, father, never returning from the Volkssturm, the grinding work of rebuilding not just structures, but trust and hope in a Germany that had to confront its past before it could imagine its future. She married in 1950, had 3 children, and eventually opened a small bookstore in Hamburg that became meeting place for people trying to make sense of what had happened and what should come next. The correspondence revealed that both paths had required courage. Both choices had demanded sacrifice. Neither was inherently more noble than the other. Those who returned helped rebuild Germany into something different than what it had been. Those who stayed helped prove America's ideals could survive contact with hard cases that tested whether mercy was principle or just convenient rhetoric. Anna's own story became something of local legend, the German prisoner who fell in love with cowboy and stayed to build life on Texas prairie. But she knew the real story was more complex than romance. It was about finding home not in place or nation, but in freedom to choose who you wanted to become. The Harrison Ranch had given her that freedom when her own country had denied it. She spent decades trying to honor that gift by living with integrity, kindness, and gratitude. She married Cole in 1948, small ceremony that Margaret insisted on making proper with white dress, borrowed from cousin in town, and reception featuring apple cobbler as wedding cake. Robert walked her down the aisle. Captain Williams attended in dress uniform. Danny served as Cole's best man, having completed his transformation from bitter antagonist to genuine friend over the 3 years since that night, working to save the calf with Marie. Anna gave birth to 2 daughters, Sarah in 1949 and Rachel in 1952. She raised them to know they were German-American, but feel fully Texan, speaking English at home, but teaching them German phrases and recipes that connected them to heritage they would never see firsthand. The girls grew up knowing their mother's story, understanding that courage sometimes meant staying when others left, choosing the harder path because it led somewhere worth going. December 1972. Anna Schmidt Mitchell stood in the Texas wind, now 52 years old, her silver hair escaping from beneath wide-brimmed hat as she watched her daughter Sarah help Cole saddle horses for afternoon ride. The ranch had changed in decades since the war expanded and modernized, but essential character remained the same. The barn where she first tasted apple cobbler still stood weathered but sturdy monument to the moment when kindness had begun breaking through hatred. She had become United States citizen in 1950 naturalization ceremony in San Antonio, where she swore allegiance to Constitution and flag with hand on heart and tears in eyes. Two daughters who knew they were German-American but felt fully Texan. A husband who had shown her that love was possible after loss, that family could be chosen as well as born into. A community that had eventually accepted her presence, even if some never quite trusted it. Margaret Harrison had died peacefully in 1955, age 85, having lived long enough to see Anna's first grandchild and hold the baby while whispering blessings in German that the child would never remember, but Anna would never forget. Robert followed in 1968 heart attack at 76 while checking fence line on the North Pasture. He died doing what he loved, which seemed appropriate for man who had lived according to clear principles, even when those principles made life complicated. Cole was now 66, still running cattle, still baking apple cobbler for every family gathering, still teaching grandchildren to ride with the same patient hands he had used to teach their mother decades earlier. His hair had gone completely gray, but his back remained straight and his eyes remained sharp with the assessment that came from lifetime of reading animals and weather and human nature. Marie had become head trauma nurse at San Antonio General Hospital, beloved by 3 decades of patients and staff. She never married, poured her considerable capacity for care into healing, rather than romance, and found satisfaction in work that honored her brother's memory by saving others. She remained close with Anna, the two women who had stood together in Texas afternoon in 1944, still standing together 28 years later, bonded by shared survival. Liesel and Way ran the most successful horse breeding operation in Hill Country, their 3 children facing prejudice, but thriving, representing future that Margaret Harrison had believed in even when others doubted. The children were American in ways their parents could never quite be, belonging fully to country that had reluctantly made space for family that violated easy categories. Danny Cooper had married in 1952, named his first son David, and visited his brother's grave in France every 5 years, telling David about the German women who taught him that mercy was strength, not weakness, that honoring sacrifice meant choosing what the fallen had believed in rather than using their deaths to justify bitterness. He had never become close friends with the German women. The wound went too deep for that, but he had reached something like peace with their presence and eventually their contribution to the community he called home. Charlotte maintained her translation service, eventually teaching her skills to younger immigrants who needed work and purpose. She never married, having seen enough of what marriage could become under stress, but she built a chosen family of people connected by shared experience of displacement and reinvention. Her diary, maintained faithfully for 30 years, eventually filled 12 volumes that she kept in locked trunk document of transformation she suspected might someday matter to historians, trying to understand this peculiar moment when enemies became neighbors and chose to stay that way. Christmas 1972 brought 3 generations of extended family to a Harrison Ranch gathering that included Anna and Cole's daughters and grandchildren. Marie, still sharp-witted at 47, Liesel and Way with their thriving children, Danny Cooper with his family, including David Jr., now 20 years old and preparing to start college, current Harrison generation running the ranch, and more than 30 people total. The long wooden table was extended to its full length, covered with white linen and set with dishes collected over decades. The meal was feast that honored multiple traditions: roasted turkey Texas beef brisket that Cole had smoked for 14 hours, German potato salad made from Liesel's grandmother's recipe, Chinese-style green beans that Way's mother had taught him to prepare cornbread, dressing that Margaret had perfected, and Anna now made every year cranberry sauce and sweet potatoes and fresh bread still warm from the oven. And 3 apple cobblers baked by Sarah, who had learned the recipe from her father, who had learned it from his grandmother, keeping tradition alive across generations and continents in the vast distance between war and peace. Before the meal, Anna stood to speak. Her English was fluent now, accent barely noticeable, except when emotion made it stronger, and today emotion was strong. 27 years ago, she began, her voice carrying across the gathered family. I stood in this ranch yard as prisoner of war, expecting cruelty and receiving kindness instead. A cowboy brought me apple cobbler and changed my life. She paused, looking at Cole with love that had only deepened across decades. The war ended, but Cole Mitchell showed me that the real battle was choosing what kind of person to become after the fighting stopped. Did you choose bitterness or hope? Revenge or mercy, hate or love? Her gesture encompassed the table, the gathered family that represented so many histories woven together. This table represents the choice this family made. Margaret Harrison chose mercy. Robert Harrison chose courage. Cole chose love. Danny chose forgiveness. And I chose to believe that home is not where you are born, but where you are free to become who you choose to be. Her voice cracked with emotion, but she continued. I was German prisoner who became American mother. Marie was orphan who became healer. Liesel was farm girl who became master horsewoman. We were given a second chance when we deserved nothing. Every day I live in this country, I try to honor that gift by living with integrity, by showing kindness to strangers, by teaching my daughters that mercy is the most powerful force in the world. She looked at her granddaughter, 4 years old, and already showing signs of the stubborn independence that ran through family lines. Because a cowboy once said apple cobbler, still hot, figured you might like some, and proved that small gestures of humanity can cascade into transformations no one anticipated. Sarah brought out the cobblers still steaming from oven, their tops, golden brown and crusted with sugar that had caramelized during baking. The scent filled the room. Cinnamon and butter and apples and memory and hope all mixed together into aroma that transcended its ingredients. Anna closed her eyes, transported for a moment to November 1944, standing in ranch yard with hands shaking as she accepted that first plate, not knowing it was the beginning of everything, not knowing kindness would save her life and give her future she had never imagined possible. She opened her eyes to see her granddaughter taking bite of cobbler, face lighting with pure joy that children feel before the world teaches them to complicate pleasure with analysis. Grandma Anna, the child asked with innocent curiosity, "Why do you always cry when we eat apple cobbler?" Anna smiled through tears that came every year, at this moment predictable as seasons, necessary as breathing. Because it reminds me that even in the darkest times, there are people who choose love, and that choice changes the world. The afternoon faded toward evening, family gathering under Texas sky that seemed impossibly vast, horizons stretching in every direction with the promise of distance and possibility. Anna and Cole stood on the ranch porch, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting on his chest, watching their family and chosen family gather in the yard where horses grazed in the same corral where Liesel had worked 27 years earlier. The barn where everything changed still stood after decades of weather and use, monument to the truth that kindness could crack open spaces where hatred had seemed complete. The smell of apple cobbler drifted on evening breeze, sweet and warm, and carrying in memories of the day when Cowboy had said simple words and changed the course of lives without knowing what he was doing or why it mattered. Anna understood now what she could not have understood then. The real war had not been between Germany and America, between prisoners and captors, between those who had lost and those who had won. The real war had been and always would be between people who chose mercy and people who chose revenge, between those who believed transformation was possible and those who insisted the past determined everything. She had chosen transformation. So had Cole and Margaret and Robert, and eventually Danny and all the others who made space for complexity in a world that preferred simple categories. That choice had required courage every day for 27 years. Some days it still did. But standing here watching her grandchildren play in the Texas twilight, while her husband held her and her chosen family gathered around her, she knew with absolute certainty that the courage had been worth it. Because sometimes enemies became neighbors. Sometimes prisoners became citizens. Sometimes hate transformed into love. Sometimes mercy proved stronger than revenge. And sometimes a cowboy said, "Apple cobbler, still hot, figured you might like some." And the world changed in ways no one could predict, but everyone could see, years later, when looking back at the path that had been walked, the choices that had been made, the lives that had been transformed by willingness to believe that people were more than their worst moments and countries were more than their darkest chapters. The sun set over Texas hills, painting the sky orange and red and purple colors that seemed too beautiful to be real, but were real nonetheless. Anna watched until the last light faded, then turned to go inside where her family waited, An apple cobbler still steamed on the table, and love proved once again that it was the most powerful force in the universe. Stronger than hate, stronger than war, stronger even than death. Because in the end, that was the only thing that mattered. Not which country you were born in, or which uniform you wore, or which side of the war you fought on. Only whether you chose mercy when given the chance. Only whether you proved that transformation was possible through daily acts of kindness and courage. Only whether you became the person who broke cycles of hatred rather than perpetuating them. Anna had made that choice. So had the others. And standing here 27 years later, surrounded by family that would not exist if different choices had been made, she knew beyond any doubt that she would make the same choice again every single day forever, because some things were worth choosing, no matter how difficult the choosing became. The smell of apple cobbler drifted on the evening breeze one last time before the wind shifted and carried it away toward the distant hills where cattle grazed and horses ran, and freedom meant the possibility that tomorrow could be different than yesterday if people had courage to make it so.